Hello, friends. We are interested in the geography of our views, so please like and write in the comments from which city are you watching us, and were there loud stories of betrayal in your city? Share your stories with us. Maybe the next betrayal story will be from your city. And we start. The sun barely filtered through the thin white blinds of a suburban ranch-style home on the outskirts of Columbus, Ohio. It was one of those houses that were built in the 70s. One story, with a low roof, faded brickwork, and a lawn where the grass was already beginning to turn yellow from the autumn cool. Inside it smelled like a mixture of freshly brewed coffee and last night's dinner. It seemed like lasagna that no one had put in the refrigerator. In the kitchen, the Keurig coffee maker hummed, releasing a thin stream of steam as a pod labeled breakfast blend slowly filled the mug. In the living room, an open space adjacent to the kitchen, an old Samsung flat-screen TV blared the MSNBC morning news. The presenter in a formal suit said something about taxes and local elections, but the sound was muffled. No one was really listening. Jason Clark stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom just down the hall. The mirror was old, with a shabby wooden frame, and hung a little crooked. He had been meaning to straighten it for a long time, but never got around to it. He was wearing a white cotton Oxford, not yet fully buttoned, and a red tie, which he was tying for the third time because the knot kept getting too thick. His dark hair, slightly touched with gray at the temples, was neatly combed back, but one strand stubbornly fell onto his forehead. He was 42 and looked like a man who knew the cameras loved his face, square jaw, straight nose, eyes the color of faded denim. But this morning there was something else in those eyes, a mixture of determination and fatigue. He rehearsed his speech, looking at his reflection, and his voice, deep and slightly hoarse, echoed in the small room. "We will build a city where everyone can be proud of their home, their street, their school," he said, pausing to straighten his tie. "We will not hide behind empty promises. We will act." He frowned, muttered, "Too pretentious," and began again. "This city deserves a leader who knows what hard work is. I am that person." He nodded to himself, but then grimaced. "Damn, that sounds like a truck commercial." The bedroom door creaked open and Emily Clark, his wife, entered. She was 38 and still looked like she could advertise a shampoo. Long blonde hair tied in a loose ponytail, delicate features slightly accentuated by morning makeup, a little foundation and mascara, nothing more. She was wearing skinny jeans and a t-shirt with a campaign logo, Jason for Mayor, in bold blue letters on a white background. In her hands she was holding a mug, the same as at all their propaganda distributions, white with the same logo and slightly peeling paint on the handle. Steam from the coffee rose in thin curls, and she smiled, handing it to him. "You're ready to smash them today," she said, and her voice was soft, with a slight hoarseness, as if she had just woken up. The smile was warm, but did not reach the eyes. Something elusive flashed there, like a shadow behind a curtain. Jason took the mug, their fingers touching for a second, his rough, short-cut nails, her thin, neatly manicured the color of a pale rose. He took a sip, winced, and placed the mug on the dresser next to the mirror. The wood of the chest of drawers was scratched, marks from the keys and coins he had thrown there over the years. On the edge stood a family photo of them, a faded snapshot from a 4th of July picnic about 5 years ago. He's wearing a baseball cap, she's wearing a straw hat. Both are smiling, holding plastic glasses of lemonade. Now the frame was covered in dust, and the glass was slightly cracked in the corner. He didn't remember when it happened. "The coffee is cold, Em," he said, without looking at her, and again reached for his tie. His tone was harsher than he intended, but he immediately softened it, adding, "Never mind. Just nerves." She crossed her arms over her chest and leaned against the door frame. Her smile did not waver, but a slight mockery appeared in it. "Nerves? At your place? Mr. I can convince anyone of anything." She stepped closer, her Nike sneakers squeaking slightly on the wooden floor. "Relax, Jace. Today it's just a barbecue. Hamburgers, hot dogs, a couple of handshakes. You are in your element." He snorted, finally tying his tie straight and turning to her. His gaze slid over her face, lingered on her lips, then returned to her eyes. It's not just barbecue, Emily. These are voices. Everyone who grabs a burger should leave thinking that I'm their guy. He paused and tapped his finger on the chest of drawers. And I can't screw up my speech. Trevor Logan is already breathing down my neck. Emily rolled her eyes, but the movement was almost imperceptible, more habit than irritation. She walked over to the chest of drawers, picked up the mug, and took a sip, as if testing his words. Her eyebrows raised slightly. Cold? Come on, he's normal. You're just being picky. She put the mug back, a little harder than necessary, and it clinked against the tree. And Trevor, that pompous turkey in a $1,000 suit, he doesn't know how to hold a grill spatula, much less run a city. Jason chuckled, but it came out dry. He buttoned the top button of his shirt and adjusted the cuffs. Maybe so, but his ratings are growing, and I have a barbecue and hope that people will remember to shake my hand. He turned to the mirror and muttered, "We need to rehearse again." Emily stepped towards him and put her hand on his shoulder. Her fingers were warm through the fabric of her shirt, and she squeezed him lightly as if she wanted to bring him back to the moment. "Jace, listen. You are real. People see this. You are not some slimy politician who promises mountains of gold. You're the one who mends fences and knows how much gas costs." She smiled wider, this time sincerely, "And you have me. We're a team, remember?" He looked at her in the mirror. Their reflections met, his serious, with slight wrinkles around his eyes, hers soft, with a slight sparkle in her eyes. For a second, he wanted to believe her completely, to drown in this picture, the perfect couple, the perfect campaign. But something stabbed in his chest, like a splinter that he could not pull out. Maybe it was her tone too rehearsed. Maybe the smell of her perfume is too strong for the morning. "Yes, team," he said finally, looking away. "Just make sure you don't run out of barbecue sauce." People love the sauce. She laughed, short and loud, and removed her hand from his shoulder. "Sauce, you say? Is this your secret to victory?" She headed for the door, calling over her shoulder, "I'll check the refrigerator. And don't forget to smile when you talk about schools. Your face is like a brick when you start talking about them." "Ha ha, very funny," he muttered, but the corner of his mouth twitched into a smile. He turned to the mirror again, muttered, "We will build a city where everyone can be proud," and stopped short. From the kitchen came the sound of the refrigerator opening, then the slam of the door. The coffee makers stopped humming, leaving a silence broken only by the voice of the MSNBC anchor. "And mayoral candidate Jason Clark will be meeting with voters today." The mug remained on the dresser, no longer smoking. Next to it is the same photo from the picnic. They looked happy in it. But now, looking at her out of the corner of his eye, Jason noticed how the dust had settled on the glass, how the crack in the corner became a little more noticeable. He clenched his fists, unclenched them, and took a deep breath. Today was an important day, and he wasn't going to fail it, not because of the cold coffee or because of anything else. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in Columbus City Park, despite an autumn breeze that blew fallen leaves across the trampled grass. The air smelled of charcoal smoke, grilled meats, and sweet barbecue sauce sizzling on the grill. The park was small, a few old oak trees, a playground with peeling paint on the carousels, and long wooden tables covered with red plastic tablecloths. Above one of the tables hung a banner taped to the floor, "Jason for Mayor, a fresh start for Columbus." The letters were slightly uneven, as if someone had typed it in a hurry, but this only added to the street charm. A country tune was playing from a portable Bluetooth speaker on the ground, something about pickup trucks and sunsets, loud enough to set the mood without drowning out the conversations. Jason Clark stood at the grill, a large black Weber with scuffed sides, deftly flipping burgers with a spatula. He was wearing the same white shirt from that morning, but now the sleeves were rolled up to his elbows, and the red tie had been replaced by a blue apron with the words "Grill Master" on it, which someone on the team had given him as a joke. Sweat ran down his temple, but he didn't pay attention. He smiled, shook hands, and handed out burgers on paper plates. The crowd around him was small, about 50 people, workers in jeans and caps, mothers with children, a couple of old men with a cane. They munched hot dogs, drank lemonade from plastic jugs, and nodded as he spoke. "We deserve a clean future," Jason said, raising his voice above the hiss of the grill. "A city where jobs don't flow abroad, where taxes go to schools and not into someone's pockets. I'm not going to lie to you, it won't be easy, but I'm the one who rolls up my sleeves and gets the job done." He jabbed his spatula into the air for added effect, and several people clapped. One guy wearing an Ohio State cap shouted, "Prove it, Clark," and Jason laughed, throwing a burger onto his plate. "Here you go, proof number one," he said, and the crowd roared approval. Nearby, at the table with leaflets, stood Emily Clark. She was wearing skinny jeans, a white t-shirt with the campaign logo, and Nike sneakers that were already slightly dusty from the grass. She let her hair down, and the wind tugged at it, forcing her to brush strands out of her face every now and then. In his hands is a stack of glossy leaflets. "Jason Clark, your voice, your mayor." She handed them out with a smile and exchanged a few words with everyone who came up. Her movements were precise, like someone who knows they're looking at her, tilting her head slightly, showing her dimples, saying something like, "Thank you for coming," or "Jason really believes this." People took leaflets, nodded, and some even took pictures with her, holding plastic cups with the campaign logo. A woman approached her with a camera and microphone, a reporter from the local WCMH channel, young, with short hair and hoop earrings. A cameraman in a wrinkled t-shirt trailed behind her, lazily holding the camera on his shoulder. The reporter, who introduced herself as Caitlin, pointed the microphone in Emily's direction. "Mrs. Clark, a few words for our viewers," she asked, leaning forward slightly. "What is it like to be the wife of a mayoral candidate? Family, campaign, all this pressure. How do you cope?" Emily smiled wider, almost automatically. She pulled her hair back and looked straight into the camera, her blue eyes sparkling in the sun. "We are a team," she said, and her voice was warm, confident, with a slight note of pride. "Jason is doing this not for himself, but for the city. And I just try to be there and support him. It's not always easy, but we believe in the same things: honesty, work, people." She nodded, as if putting an end to it, and handed Caitlin the leaflet. "Here, take it. Everything he fights for is there." Caitlin took the flyer and smiled back. "Well said. Good luck to both of you." She waved to the operator, and they walked over to the grill, where Jason was already handing out hot dogs to the kids, loudly joking about how he won't burn them this time. Emily watched them go, then looked at Jason. He caught her eye, winked, and she waved her hand briefly in a friendly way. The crowd clapped, someone turned up the music, and the country music gave way to something more lively, with a guitar riff. The day went by like clockwork. Late evening. Silence fell over the Clark house again. The barbecue had ended a couple of hours ago, and now the living room smelled of leftover sauce and the slight smoke that Jason carried on his clothes. He was sitting on the sofa, an old one, upholstered in gray fabric with stains from spilled beer, wearing only jeans and a t-shirt, barefoot. On the coffee table in front of him was a bottle of Bud Light, half empty, and a plate with a half-eaten sandwich, a piece of rye bread and ham that he had whipped up. The television was off, and the only sound was the ticking of the American flag wall clock, a gift from some constituent. Jason rubbed his neck and leaned back on the couch. The day went better than he expected. People laughed, ate, and listened. He even managed to shake hands with some local union boss who promised to talk to his guys. But fatigue still weighed on my shoulders like a heavy backpack. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to relax. A rustling sound came from the kitchen. Emily stood at the sink, her back to him. She was still wearing the same t-shirt, but had traded her jeans for soft gray leggings. The water flowed in a thin stream as she washed the plates, a stack of paper plates they hadn't had time to throw away after the barbecue, and a couple of glass glasses. Her movements were slow, almost lazy. She held a sponge in one hand and a phone in the other, pressed to her ear. The light from the screen reflected on her face, and she spoke quietly, almost in a whisper. "Everything is under control," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the water. Yes, today was perfect. She fell silent, listening, then chuckled briefly. Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. Jason opened his eyes and turned his head towards the kitchen. He did not hear words, only the light hum of her voice mixed with the splash of water. He frowned and sat up straighter. Um, he called, rubbing his chin. Who are you whispering to? She shuddered barely noticeably, but still shuddered. The phone disappeared into his leggings pocket faster than he could blink. She turned around, turned off the water, and wiped her hands on a towel hanging on the oven handle. Yes, with Mom, she said, and her smile returned like a mask that she put on in a second. She asked how the day was. I said you were a star. Jason nodded, but something stirred in his chest, either doubt or just fatigue. He took a bottle of beer and took a sip. Tell her hi, he muttered and leaned back on the sofa. Emily turned back to the sink. Her fingers slid towards the wedding ring, a thin gold band with a small diamond. She took it off and placed it on the windowsill next to the sink, where there were already a couple of dried crumbs from the morning toast. We need to wash the dishes, she said louder, as if making excuses. I don't want it to get dirty. Jason chuckled without turning around. Yes, of course, he muttered, looking at the ceiling. The water began to rustle again, and he closed his eyes, not noticing how her hand froze for a second over the phone in his pocket. The ring lay alone on the windowsill, glistening in the light of the lamp. And outside the window, the wind blew leaves along the dark street, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. It was hot in the studio of the talk show Columbus Tonight, despite the humming air conditioners hidden somewhere behind the black ceiling panels. The spotlight was in his eyes, reflecting off the glossy table and causing Jason Clark to squint as he adjusted the microphone attached to the lapel of his dark blue jacket. The studio was small, typical for a local cable channel. A round table made of cheap plastic covered with wood, 3 hardback chairs, and a fake cityscape in the background, the blurry lights of Columbus, filmed about 10 years ago. The host, Rick Harper, a balding man in his 50s with a voice like he'd smoked Marlboro all his life, sat between Jason and his opponent, Trevor Logan. There were about 20 spectators in the studio, local activists, a couple of journalists, and a few curious people who simply had nothing better to do on a Wednesday evening. Rick leaned forward, tapped his pen on the table, and grinned at the camera. So, gentlemen, let's talk about the budget, he began, looking between Jason and Trevor. Mr. Clark, you promised to reduce taxes and at the same time repair schools. How are you going to pull this off? Money doesn't fall from the sky. Jason straightened up, clasping his hands in front of him. He knew that the camera was now taking a close-up and tried to make his face calm, confident, no wrinkles on his forehead, just a slight smile. His voice sounded evenly with that hoarseness that people liked at rallies. Rick, this isn't about magic. This is about priorities, he said, looking straight into the lens. We've been spending millions on unnecessary projects for too long, like that parking lot at City Hall that no one uses. I propose to reduce such expenses and redistribute funds. Schools come first. In our Franklinton neighborhood, roofs are leaking and children are sitting with textbooks that are 20 years old. This is not normal. We will find money by removing fat from the budget. The audience applauded, not loudly, but enough for him to feel a surge of confidence. He nodded, leaned back in his chair, and glanced at Trevor. He was sitting on the other side of the table, wearing an expensive gray suit that probably cost more than the average teacher's monthly salary. Trevor Logan was younger than Jason, about 35, with a clean-shaven face, dark hair gelled, and a smile that looked like a toothpaste commercial. He tapped his fingers on the table as if he was waiting for his turn, and when Rick turned to him, Trevor spoke without hesitation. Well, Jason, that sounds nice, he said, his voice smooth, slightly mocking. But let's figure it out. You want to cut back on unnecessary projects, as you call them. For example, the same parking lot. Do you know that she brings the city $100,000 a year? And that your cuts will hurt jobs, the same construction workers you promised to support, and the schools. You're planning to freeze repairs in the eastern areas in order to transfer money to Franklinton, right? Not really, as they say. Jason froze. His smile wavered, but he quickly pulled himself together. How the hell does Trevor know about the eastern regions? This was part of his internal strategy. He discussed it only with the team, in a closed office, over pizza and coffee. He didn't even mention it publicly. He opened his mouth to object, but Trevor had already continued, not allowing him to get a word in edgewise. And one more thing, Trevor leaned forward, his eyes sparkling under the spotlight. You are talking about fat in the budget. What about your plans to subsidize small businesses? These are millions that you want to take out of other programs. People have a right to know that you sacrifice for your ideas. The spectators began to make noise. Rick raised his hand for silence, but Jason could already feel the sweat chilling on the back of his neck. Trevor knew too much. Not just general numbers that could be gleaned from old reports, but precise details, subsidies, priorities, even the order of districts. This was no accident. He clenched his fists under the table and forced himself to smile. Trevor, you are a master at turning everything upside down, he said, trying to keep his voice even. I'm not a victim, I'm optimizing. Business means jobs. Schools are the future. What about your beautiful numbers about parking? Half of that money goes to maintenance, not to the budget. People see this. Trevor just grinned and leaned back like he'd won the round. Rick clapped his hands to announce the commercial, and the spotlights flickered to dim mode. Jason took off the microphone, stood up, nodded to a couple of spectators who waved to him from the audience. But inside his brain was working at full capacity. How does Trevor know all this? Someone is leaking. Someone close. At home, it was past midnight when Jason parked his Ford Explorer in the driveway. The headlights illuminated the peeling paint on the garage door, then went off, leaving the house in semi-darkness. He spent the entire day bouncing around in post-talk show meetings, shaking hands with businessmen, talking briefly with the union, trying to rewrite a speech for the next rally. Fatigue hummed in my bones like an old engine, but my head wouldn't turn off. Trevor, his words, those damn details. He entered through the back door, threw the keys on the kitchen table, wooden, with worn corners, bought at a crossroads after the wedding. The house was quiet, only the same wall clock with a flag was ticking. The lights in the living room were off, but in the kitchen the lamp over the sink was on, filling the room with a soft yellow light. Emily stood there, wearing a gray hoodie and the same leggings from yesterday. She was pouring water into a kettle old, with rust stains around the spout. Her bag lay on the table, with a stack of leaflets sticking out of it, and next to it was her phone, face down. Jason took off his jacket and hung it over the back of his chair. His gaze fell on the sink. Two wine glasses, thin, with long stems, stood there, slightly stained with red. He frowned. He didn't drink today, and he hasn't been home at all since this morning. 2 glasses. 2. He called, unbuttoning the top button of his shirt. His voice was hoarse from fatigue, but there was already a hint of something sharp in it. Have you watched the show? She turned around, put the kettle on the stove, and turned on the gas. The flame flared up with a slight hiss, and she smiled lightly, as if nothing had happened. Yes, I turned it on for a couple of minutes, she said, shrugging her shoulders. You were good, as always. He stepped closer and leaned his hand on the tabletop. His fingers tapped on the wood, betraying the tension. Trevor knew things he shouldn't know, he said, looking into her eyes. About the budget, about subsidies, about the eastern regions. This was not in my speeches. He paused and swallowed. You weren't chatting with anyone about my strategy, were you? Her smile wavered, but immediately returned, wider and a little more mocking. She laughed shortly, loudly, as if he had said something absurd. Are you serious? She asked, crossing her arms. Jace, you're paranoid. What do you think I do? Sit around and gossip with the neighbors about your plans. I don't even remember these numbers. You know how much I hate accounting. He looked at her, trying to catch at least something, the shadow in her gaze, the trembling in her voice. But she stood calmly, her head slightly bowed, and her blue eyes were clear as glass. The kettle began to whistle, and she turned to take it off the heat. I've been traveling all day, he said more quietly, almost muttering. His gaze fell again on the glasses. And here are 2 glasses. Did you drink with someone? She froze for a second, barely noticeable, but he caught it. Then she turned around, holding the teapot in her hands, and her eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Oh, this? She nodded towards the sink. Yes, I just relaxed after your show. She poured herself some wine, then a little more. I didn't want to drink tea all evening. She put the teapot on the table and shrugged. Don't worry, I didn't drink myself into oblivion. Jason nodded, slowly, but something stirred inside him, like a splinter he couldn't pull out. He ran his hand through his hair and exhaled. Okay, he muttered. It's all strange. She stepped towards him, put her hand on his shoulder, and squeezed him lightly. You're tired, Jace. Go to bed. Tomorrow is a new day, new battles. She smiled, softly, almost tenderly, and went into the living room, leaving him alone. He stood looking at the glasses. 2. Red wine. And the smell of her perfume a little sharper than usual, mixed with something else that he could not detect. He clenched his fists, unclenched them, and turned to the sink. The water in the kettle was cooling, and the ticking of the clock became louder in the empty kitchen. The night in the Clarks' suburban home was deep and heavy, like an old blanket that had been sitting in the closet too long. Outside the window, the wind rustled the bare branches of the maple trees, occasionally casting their shadows on the bedroom walls through the thin blinds. The clock on Jason's bedside table, an old digital alarm clock with red numbers, showed 2:58, and the silence in the house was almost palpable, broken only by the slight hum of a refrigerator somewhere below and the occasional creaking of the floorboards, settling under their own weight. Jason slept restlessly, his face buried in his pillow, one arm dangling over the edge of the bed, the sheets bunched at his feet. He dreamed of something vague, a talk show, Trevor Logan's voice, the laughter of the crowd, but the dream was interrupted by a sharp sound. Cotton. Dull, short, as if someone had carelessly closed the door. Jason winced and opened his eyes. The numbers on the alarm clock changed to 3:01. He lay motionless, listening, trying to figure out if he was dreaming. My heart beat a little faster than necessary, driving the remnants of sleep out of my head. He turned his head. The bed next to him was empty. The sheet on Emily's side was cold. The pillow was slightly wrinkled, but she herself was not there. He frowned and rubbed his face with his palm, feeling the stubble scratching his skin. He muttered hoarsely, not yet fully awake. There was no answer, only silence, and somewhere in the distance, a dog howled briefly, sadly. He sat up and threw the sheet aside. He was wearing an old t-shirt with a faded Ohio State logo and gray shorts that he had been wearing at night for about 5 years. His bare feet touched the cold wooden floor, and he winced he should have laid the carpet a long time ago, but his hands didn't get around to it. The sound was repeated, not a clap, but something softer, like footsteps. It was downstairs in the living room. He stood up, stretched, feeling his muscles ache after a long day, and walked to the bedroom door. It was slightly open, and a thin strip of light from the corridor fell onto the floor, illuminating the dusty corner by the chest of drawers. Jason walked down the stairs, holding onto the railing old, with peeling paint that creaked under his weight. The staircase led directly into the living room, which was open with a low ceiling and the same gray sofa he had sat on yesterday. The lights were off, but there was a faint yellow beam coming from the kitchen, the lamp over the sink, which Emily often left on. He stepped down and immediately saw her. Emily stood in the living room by the window with her back to it. She was wearing the same gray hoodie as yesterday, the hood pulled back, her hair disheveled over her shoulders. She held the phone to her ear, pressing it with her shoulder, while her other hand fiddled with the drawstring of her hoodie. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, muffled by the noise of the wind behind the glass. "Yes, I understand," she said, and there was something strange in her tone, not irritation, not drowsiness, but intense concentration. No, he didn't notice anything. Everything is fine. Jason froze on the last step. His eyebrows furrowed and his eyes narrowed. He coughed loudly, deliberately, and Emily flinched and turned around sharply. The phone disappeared into his hoodie pocket faster than he could blink. She looked at him with wide-open eyes, but then smiled quickly, a little nervously, like a person caught in a petty lie. "Jace, you scared me," she said, pressing her hand to her chest. Her voice was a little higher than usual, but she immediately pulled herself together. "What are you doing? I thought you were sleeping." He came down the stairs and came closer. The floor was cold under his feet, and he noticed her scarf, the one with the initials J and E embroidered on it, a gift for their 5th anniversary. It lay on the carpet next to the sofa, crumpled, as if she had abandoned it in a hurry. Jason stopped a couple of steps away from her, crossing his arms over his chest. The door slammed. "Woke me up," he said, looking into her eyes. His voice was low, hoarse from sleep, but there was already a hint of suspicion in it. "Who are you calling at 3 in the morning?" Emily blinked, then laughed, short, almost sincere. She brushed her hair out of her face and stepped towards the sofa, as if trying to fill the space between them with movement. "Mom," she said, shrugging. "She hasn't been sleeping well lately, you know." "I called to complain that the neighbor's dog was barking again. I didn't want to wake you up, so I came down here." Jason looked at her without moving. Her words sounded smooth, too smooth, like a line from a memorized script. He noticed how her fingers trembled slightly as she fiddled with the drawstring of her hoodie, but her face remained calm, a smile, dimples on her cheeks, slightly narrowed eyes. He nodded slowly, but his gaze fell on the scarf. J and E. My heart pounded, not painful, but unpleasant, like a pin prick. "To Mom, then," he muttered, rubbing his chin. "Tell her to buy earplugs." She chuckled, stepped towards him, and laid her hand on his shoulder lightly, almost weightlessly. "Definitely," she said, and her voice became softer. "Go to bed, Jace. You have a meeting with these trade union guys tomorrow. You can't look like a zombie." He nodded again, but didn't move. His eyes darkened, a shadow fell on his face, but he remained silent. She removed her hand, turned and walked towards the kitchen, her steps almost silent on the carpet. Jason watched her go until she disappeared around the corner. He bent down and picked up the scarf from the floor. The fabric was soft, slightly cool, and smelled of her perfume, floral, with a hint of vanilla. He clenched it in his fist, threw it back onto the sofa, and went upstairs. The stairs creaked louder than usual. Morning came with gray light breaking through the clouds. Jason woke up late. The alarm clock said 7:42, and he cursed under his breath, realizing he was late for morning coffee with the team. Emily was no longer in the bedroom. The bed on her side was neatly made, the pillow fluffed. He went downstairs, rubbing his neck, feeling the fatigue from yesterday still clinging to his muscles. The kitchen smelled of coffee. That same Keurig hummed, releasing steam as a dark roast pod filled the mug. Emily stood at the table, already dressed. Jeans, a t-shirt with the campaign logo, and on top a light jacket, dark green, with a hood. She was scrolling through something on her phone, but immediately put it away when he entered. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said with a smile, handing him a mug. "I already thought about waking you up." He took the coffee, took a sip, and nodded. "Thank you," he muttered, putting the mug on the table. His gaze fell on the coat rack by the back door. There was her jacket hanging there, another one, the one she wore yesterday on the talk show. Black, with leather inserts. He came closer, ostensibly to take his keys, which were lying nearby. The smell hit her nose, not her perfume, not vanilla and flowers, but something sharp, masculine. Aftershave lotion with a hint of sandalwood and something metallic. He froze and took a deep breath to make sure. It wasn't his scent. He wore plain Old Spice cologne, if he even remembered to shave. "Did you go somewhere this morning?" he asked without turning around. His voice was level, but something solid rang in it. Emily looked at him and raised her eyebrows. "No, just in the yard to check the mail," she said, shrugging her shoulders. "Why?" He turned and looked into her eyes. They were clean, calm, but his own darkened even more. He clenched his jaw and nodded. "Just like that," he said quietly, and took the keys. The jacket hung on a hanger, and the smell of lotion lingered in the air, mingling with the aroma of coffee. The scarf still lay on the living room carpet, crumpled, with J and E embroidered on it, a reminder of something he couldn't yet name. He left the house, slamming the door a little harder than necessary. The car started the first time, but he sat in it for a minute, staring into space before moving off. Jason Clark's campaign office was located in a rented building on the outskirts of Columbus, a former warehouse converted into something more or less decent. The walls were painted with cheap white paint, which was already beginning to peel at the baseboards, and the floor was covered with gray carpet, speckled with stains from spilled coffee and God knows what else. The space was cramped, a couple of folding tables littered with papers and flyers, a few chairs with plastic seats, and an old coffee machine in the corner that hummed like a broken tractor, but still dispensed something vaguely resembling espresso. On one of the walls hung a poster, Jason for Mayor a Fresh Start, taped to it with tape that was already starting to peel off in the corners. Outside the only window, clouded with dust, one could see a parking lot with cracked asphalt and a couple of rusty pickup trucks. Jason was sitting at one of the tables, staring at his laptop, an old Dell with a cracked screen frame. He was wearing the same white shirt he wore on the talk show, but now wrinkled, with the sleeves rolled up, and jeans, which he wore instead of suit pants. His hair was disheveled, as if he had run his hand through it 100 times in the last half hour, and there were shadows under his eyes, a trace of a sleepless night and morning coffee that did not help. There was a stack of papers in front of him, budget printouts, meeting schedules, speech outlines, but he didn't look at them. His eyes were glued to the screen where he was scrolling through the tape of the talk show, stopping again and again at the moment when Trevor Logan mentioned the eastern regions. The office door slammed, and in walked Mike Reed, his best friend and right-hand man in the campaign. Mike was a couple of years older than Jason, with broad shoulders, close-cropped brown hair, and a face that looked like he'd been hit one too many times in college basketball. He was wearing a black sweatshirt with a Buckeyes logo, faded jeans, and Adidas sneakers that squeaked on the carpet. In his hand, he held a paper cup of Dunkin' Donuts with a leaking logo. The coffee, judging by the smell, was cinnamon, and Mike took sip after sip, wincing from the heat. "Damn, it's like a morgue in here," Mike said, looking around the office. His voice was loud, with a slight Midwestern accent that he had never lost over the years. "Have you been sitting here all night?" Jason didn't look up, just nodded, clicking his mouse to rewind the video. "Almost," he muttered. "I can't sleep." Mike threw his backpack onto the next chair, plopped down opposite Jason, and put the glass on the table. The coffee splashed slightly over the edge, leaving a brown stain on the edge of some leaflet. "What a look you have, brother," he said, leaning back. "It's like you were run over by a truck." "What happened? Talk show. I saw you were doing fine." Jason finally looked up from the screen and looked at Mike. His eyes were tired, but something sharp burned in them, like sparks from a grindstone. "Fine?" he asked, and bitterness flashed in his voice. Trevor knew things he shouldn't have known. About the budget, about subsidies, about the eastern regions, damn it. He pointed his finger at the screen, where Trevor's face was frozen in a smug grin. "This is not an accident, Mike. Someone is leaking my moves." Mike frowned, took another sip of coffee, and put the glass back. He rubbed his chin, covered with 2 days' stubble, and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Seriously?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "You are sure? Maybe he just guessed right? Or dug something out of old reports?" Jason shook his head, clenching his fists until his knuckles turned white. "No, Mike, this is not a guess. Eastern regions, this was only in draft. We discussed it here in this office a week ago. Nobody except the team knew." He paused and exhaled through his nose. And he didn't just know. He used it as a weapon. Exactly, clearly, as if he had my plan in hand. Mike whistled and leaned back. His chair creaked under the weight, and he tapped his fingers on the table thoughtfully. "Okay, let's say you're right," he said slowly. "Leak. This is bad. Very bad. We need to figure out who. We have, 6 people on our team, plus volunteers, someone chatty, or..." He hesitated, looked at Jason as if weighing his words. "Or someone is playing both sides." Jason nodded and rubbed his temples. His gaze fell on the plastic bottle of water standing next to the laptop, half empty, with a crumpled Dasani label. He took it and squeezed it in his hand, feeling the plastic crunch under his fingers. "I thought about it," he said quietly. "Someone close. Someone who knows everything." He squeezed the bottle harder, and it cracked, squeezing a couple of drops onto the table. He threw it back and wiped his hand on his jeans. "But who, Mike? Who?" Mike looked at him with one eye narrowed. He took another sip of coffee, then put the glass down and leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Listen, Jace, I'll tell you straight," he began, his tone becoming wary. "We need to check everyone. Everyone who was at that meeting. Kate with the finances, Dan with the flyers, even that volunteer kid who carries the coffee." He paused and swallowed. "And Emily." The name hung in the air like the smell of spilled gasoline. Jason froze, his hand frozen on the table. He slowly raised his eyes to Mike, and something dark flashed in his gaze, a mixture of anger and pain. "What did you say?" he asked, and his voice became low, almost menacing. Mike raised his hands defensively. Hey, don't rush at me," he said quickly. "I'm not saying she's to blame. I say we need to check everyone. She's your wife, yes, but she goes with you everywhere. In meetings, at home, everywhere. She hears everything. If someone is digging under you, He hesitated, searching for words. She could have said something accidentally, or not by chance. Jason slammed his fist on the table, not hard, but enough to make the flyers jump. His face turned red and his jaw clenched. "She's my wife, damn it," he growled, glaring at Mike. "Do you think she runs to Trevor and leaks my plans? Is that what you mean?" Mike didn't look away, but his voice became quieter, calmer. "I don't think anything, Jace. I say we cannot exclude anyone. You said it yourself, someone close. She's the closest." He paused and nodded at the crushed bottle. "You're angry because you know I'm right. We need to check." Jason leaned back in his chair and ran his hands over his face. His chest was heaving as if he had just run a mile. He looked at Mike, then at the bottle, then at the poster on the wall. Everything was boiling inside him: anger, fatigue, doubt. Emily, her night whisper, jacket with lotion scent, 2 glasses in the sink. He clenched his teeth until his jaw ached. No, she couldn't. She is his wife. They are a team. But the splinter in my chest grew, biting deeper. "She's my wife," he repeated, but now more quietly, almost in a whisper, as if he was convincing himself. He rubbed his neck and exhaled. "Okay, check everyone. But she can only be touched through me. Understood?" Mike nodded, picked up his glass, and finished his coffee in one gulp. "Got it, boss," he said, standing up. "I'll start with Kate and Dan. Let's see who knows what. Hold on, okay? We still have to win elections." He tapped Jason on the shoulder, grabbed his backpack, and walked out, leaving behind the smell of cinnamon and an empty Dunkin' glass on the table. Jason sat silently, staring at the crushed bottle of water. A drop ran down her side and fell on a leaflet with his face and the inscription, "Your voice." He clenched his fists and unclenched them, but the conflict inside did not subside. Trust fought with intuition, like two animals in a cage. Outside the window, the wind blew garbage across the parking lot, and the coffee machine hummed again, dispensing another portion of unnecessary swill. The evening in Columbus was damp and cold. The sky was overcast with gray clouds, and light rain pattered on the asphalt, leaving shiny spots under the streetlights. Jason Clark sat in his campaign office, still behind the same folding desk, littered with papers. The light from the table lamp, a cheap one bought at Walmart, hit his face, emphasizing the shadows under his eyes and the sharp lines of his cheekbones. He leafed through the budget printout, but the letters blurred before his eyes. His thoughts were somewhere far away. The conversation with Mike, the smell of lotion on Emily's jacket, her nightly whispers, all this was spinning in my head like a broken record. He rubbed his temples, trying to push away the fatigue, when the phone on the table vibrated, breaking the silence. The screen lit up. "Mike?" Jason grabbed the phone and pressed the green button. "Yes, Mike, what?" His voice was hoarse, harsh, as if he was expecting bad news. There was a noise at the other end of the line, the wind, the rustle of tires on a wet road, a distant horn. Mike spoke quickly, his voice tense. "Jace, listen carefully," he began, and his tone lacked the usual lightness. "I just saw Emily. She was at the motel, the one on the highway, the Route 66 in, and she wasn't alone. Trevor Logan was with her." Jason froze. His fingers squeezed the phone so hard that the plastic creaked. It was as if something had burst in my chest, cold, heavy, like a piece of ice falling into my stomach. "What did you say?" he asked quietly, but steel was already ringing in his voice. "I was driving by," Mike continued, slightly out of breath, as if he was talking on the go. "Her car was in the parking lot, a white Toyota Camry, the same license plate. I checked. They left a room together, got into different cars, and drove off. I'm not making this up, Jace. This was half an hour ago." Jason was silent. His gaze fell on the table, on the crushed bottle of water that was still lying there from the morning, on the flyer with his face and the words, "Your voice." He clenched his jaw, feeling his teeth grind against each other. "You are sure?" he asked finally, his voice low, almost menacing. "100%, Mike replied. "I wouldn't call if I wasn't sure." "What are you going to do?" Jason didn't answer. He threw the phone on the table, left the ringer on, and grabbed his car keys, a set of keychains in the shape of an Ohio State football. Mike shouted something into the phone, but Jason was no longer listening. He rushed out of the office, slamming the door so that the poster on the wall completely peeled off from one corner and hung like a flag of surrender. The rain hit his face, cold drops ran down his cheeks, but he did not notice. His Ford Explorer sat in the parking lot, wet and dark under a streetlight. He got behind the wheel, started the engine, and the car took off, the tires squealing on the wet asphalt. The Route 66 in was 10 miles from downtown, on an old highway that had once been bustling with life, but was now just gas stations with peeling signs and motels like that, cheap, faceless, for those who wanted to hide. The motel sign flashed neon letters, red and blue, but half the bulbs had long since burned out, and it reads something like Route 6 in. The building was one story, with a long row of doors painted a dirty green and cracked plaster on the walls. In front of him stretched the parking lot, narrow, with potholes where puddles accumulated. The rain pattered on the roof, and the old air conditioner, sticking out of the reception window, hummed like a broken fan, releasing a thin stream of steam into the damp air. Jason pulled into the parking lot. The headlights of his car illuminated the rows of parked cars. A rusty pickup truck, an old sedan with a dented bumper, and a white Toyota Camry. His heart skipped a beat. It was her car. He recognized the sticker on the rear window, a small star that she had put on a couple of years ago, saying it was for good luck. The license plate was the same one he saw in his driveway every day. The car was empty, the windows were fogged up from the rain, but she was there. Here. He turned off the engine, but did not get out immediately. His fingers squeezed the keys in his hand so tightly that the metal dug into his palm, leaving red marks. He looked at the motel, at the dim light coming from under the reception door, at the dark windows of the rooms. The rain pattered on the roof of the car, drowning out the hum of the air conditioner, but not drowning out the noise in his head. Emily, Trevor, here. His breathing became heavy and ragged, as if he was running rather than sitting still. He squeezed the keys even harder, feeling the sharp edge of the keychain cutting his skin, but the pain only clarified his thoughts. He opened the car door and stepped into the rain. Cold drops instantly wetted his shirt and stuck his hair to his forehead, but he didn't notice. His gaze fell on the passenger seat. There was a photograph lying there, old, slightly wrinkled. He and Emily at the fair 3 years ago. He in a baseball cap, she with cotton candy, both laughing, and behind them is a Ferris wheel against the backdrop of the sunset. The photo fell out of the glove compartment, probably when he braked suddenly. He froze, looking at him. Their smiles, their past. He clenched his jaw and slammed the door without taking the photo. Jason walked up to the reception desk and pushed open the glass door with a crack in the corner, plastered with "no smoking" and "cash only" stickers. The inside smelled of cheap deodorant, some kind of lemon spray that couldn't cover up the smell of dampness and old carpets. A guy in his 20s, wearing a wrinkled Metallica t-shirt, sat behind the counter, lazily leafing through a car magazine. The air conditioner hummed overhead, dripping drops of water into a plastic bowl on the floor. The guy looked up and nodded. "Do you need a number?" he asked, chewing gum. Jason shook his head, clenching his fists in his jeans pockets. "No," he said, and his voice was hoarse, as if he had swallowed sand. "I'm looking for someone. The woman, blonde, was here recently, with a man, dark-haired, in a suit." The guy shrugged and returned to the magazine. "A lot of people come here, dude. I don't follow them." He smacked his gum and turned the page. Jason stepped closer and leaned his hands on the counter. His fingers left wet marks on the worn plastic. "White Toyota Camry in the parking lot," he said, lowering his voice. "She was here, I know. What number?" The guy looked at him, narrowed his eyes, but then sighed and threw the magazine on the counter. Okay, don't get angry," he muttered, opening a tattered notebook. "An hour ago, number 7. But they left, man. There's no one there." Jason nodded and straightened up. His hand clutched the keys in his pocket again, the metal dug deeper, but he felt no pain. Number 7. He turned and walked back out into the rain without saying a word. The door slammed behind him and the glass shook. He approached number 7. The door was closed. The lights were off. The curtains were drawn. He stood there, looking at the peeling paint, at the puddle on the threshold. The rain ran down his face, mixing with sweat, but he did not move. The Toyota Camry sat in the parking lot, empty as proof, and on the passenger seat of his car lay a photograph forgotten, wet from his hands, with their smiles that now seemed alien. He clenched his fists, turned around, and walked back to the car. The keys left a red mark on his palm, but he didn't notice. The engine started with a growl, and he drove away, leaving the motel in the rearview mirror with the neon sign still flashing in the darkness. The rain was still pattering on the roof of the Route 66 Inn when Jason Clark pulled up to the motel again. It was already past midnight, and the neon sign was blinking dimmer than a couple of hours ago, as if tired of the dampness and loneliness. His Ford Explorer pulled into the parking lot, headlights illuminating the wet asphalt, and Emily's white Toyota Camry still parked where he had seen it before. But now there was another car nearby, a black BMW with tinted windows, parked slightly crookedly, as if the driver was in a hurry. Jason turned off the engine, and the silence fell on his ears, broken only by the patter of droplets on the hood and the distant hum of the air conditioner at the reception. He got out of the car without taking an umbrella or putting on a jacket. His shirt, the same white, wrinkled, with rolled-up sleeves, immediately became wet and stuck to his shoulders, but he didn't notice. The keys in his hand were cold, slippery from the rain, and he squeezed them so that the metal dug into his palm, leaving red streaks. After Mike's call, he couldn't sit still. His friend's words burned like hot coal, and he returned here to the motel, driven by something between rage and despair. He didn't know what he would find, but he knew he had to see it for himself. Jason approached number 7, the same one that the guy from the reception had named. The door was slightly open, a thin crack let in a faint light from inside, and voices could be heard from there. Short, masculine, with a slight mockery, Trevor Logan, and the other, soft but tense, Emily. "Hi, Emily." My heart beat faster, my blood pounded in my temples, drowning out the sound of the rain. He stepped closer, pressed himself against the wall next to the door, feeling the rough plaster scratching his shoulder. The door creaked, opening a little wider under his weight, and he looked inside. The room was small, cramped, with a low ceiling and wallpaper yellowed with age. An old air conditioner hummed in the corner, dripping drops into a tin can on the floor. There was a table in the middle of the room, rickety, wooden, covered in papers, printouts, graphs, what looked like his own budget drafts. On the table there was a bottle of Jack Daniel's whiskey, half empty, and 2 glasses, one with ice left over. And at the table Trevor Logan sat in a chair, leaning back, wearing only a gray shirt with the top button undone, without the expensive suit he wore on the talk show. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and he had a smug smile on his face, as if he had just won a poker game. Emily stood opposite him. She was half naked. She was wearing only a white t-shirt, too short to hide her black lace underwear, and nothing else. The jeans were lying on the floor by the bed, next to her Nike sneakers. Her hair was down, slightly damp, as if she had just gotten out of the shower, and she was holding one of the documents in her hands, fiddling with its edge. "He won't even guess," Trevor said, twirling the glass in his hand. His voice was smooth, confident. "You're doing great, Em. These numbers are gold. He'll be like a blind puppy at a debate." Emily chuckled, but her smile was forced. She threw the paper on the table and crossed her arms over her chest. "Don't go too far, Trev," she said quietly. "He's not a fool. Just too busy with myself." Jason felt the air knocked out of his lungs. His hand clenched the door frame, his nails digging into the peeling paint. He pushed the door harder, and it swung open with a thud, hitting the wall. Emily shuddered and turned around, her eyes widening in horror. Trevor jumped out of his chair, almost knocking over his glass. His smile disappeared, replaced by cold surprise. "Jason," Emily gasped, her voice trembling. She stepped back, bumped into the table, grabbed her t-shirt, trying to cover herself, but it was too late. He entered the room, his steps were heavy, his wet sneakers left dirty marks on the carpet. The rain flowed from his hair and dripped onto the floor, but his eyes burned dark, furious, like a stormy sky. He stopped a couple of steps away from them, clenched his fists, feeling the keys in his pocket, cutting his skin even deeper. "Have you played for both sides?" he asked, his voice low and hoarse, almost a growl. He looked at Emily without taking his eyes off, ignoring Trevor. "What did he promise you, Em? Money? A place on his team? What?" Emily turned pale, and her lips trembled. She clutched the t-shirt in her hands and pressed it to her chest, but didn't answer right away. Her gaze flickered to Trevor, then back to Jason, with a mixture of fear and defiance. "You abandoned me for this campaign," she finally blurted out, and her voice broke into a scream. "You don't even notice me, Jace. All you care about is your damn voices, your speeches, your city. I'm just a decoration for you to wave to the crowd and hand out leaflets." Jason stepped closer, his face contorted with anger. He pointed a finger in her direction, then at the table where his documents lay, his plans, his work, now in the hands of the enemy. "I made you the first lady, and you made me a clown," he barked, his voice drowned out by the hum of the air conditioner. "You sold me, Emily. You sitting here, half naked, with this bastard, spying on me. What the hell did you even want?" Trevor raised his hands and stepped forward, trying to wedge himself between them. "Hey, Clark, chill," he said, his tone conciliatory, but there was a hint of mockery in his eyes. "It's not what you think. We just—" "Shut up," Jason interrupted him, turning to him so sharply that Trevor retreated. His gaze fell on the table, on the bottle of whiskey, on the glasses, on the papers. Everything inside him was boiling like lava, ready to burst out. He grabbed the table lamp, an old one, with a battered shade, standing on the edge of the table, and threw it against the wall. The glass shattered with a loud crash, shards splashed across the carpet, the lampshade crumpled like paper. Emily screamed and stepped back. Trevor cursed, covering his face with his hand. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Jason growled, looking back at Emily. His chest heaved, his fists shook. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed everything I stand for. This city, these people. For what? For his sake?" He nodded at Trevor without looking at him. Emily pursed her lips, her eyes sparkling with tears, but she didn't look away. She straightened up, tossing her t-shirt on the table, as if she no longer cared about how she looked. "I wanted you to notice me," she said, and her voice became quieter but sharper. "Do you think I'm happy to stand behind you while you build your empire? Trevor gave me what you couldn't attention. And yes, I gave him your plans, because this is all you left me." Jason looked at her, and something flashed in his eyes, not only anger, but also pain, deep, like a knife in the back. He opened his mouth to answer, but the words got stuck in his throat. He clenched his fists even tighter, feeling the blood running down his palm from the keys, but did not unclench them. Trevor coughed and stepped towards the desk, trying to collect the papers. "Let's all calm down," he said, but his voice was shaking. "It's not worth it, Clark." Jason turned to him, his gaze like a blow. He stepped forward and Trevor stepped back, bumping into a chair. "Don't you dare tell me what's worth it and what's not," Jason growled. "Do you think this is a game? You stole my wife, my plans, my campaign. You're scum." He turned to Emily, looked at her again, at her pale face, at the tears that she did not wipe away, at her half-naked body, which now seemed alien. He wanted to say something else, but instead he just shook his head. Shards of the lamp crunched under his feet as he walked towards the door. The rain rushed in, cold and harsh, but he didn't turn around. The door remained open, flapping in the wind, and he walked out into the night, leaving them behind. He sat in the car, wet, trembling, with blood on his palm. He threw the keys on the seat, next to that photo from the fair, now wet and wrinkled. His fist struck the steering wheel, once, twice, until the horn blared in the darkness. The betrayal was complete, and it burned him from the inside like acid. The morning in the Clark house came gray and heavy, like a hangover after a long night. It was still drizzling outside the window, leaving cloudy streaks on the glass of the kitchen window, through which a faint light was shining. The house, that same suburban ranch in Columbus, now seemed not cozy, but empty, like a shell from which all living things had been taken out. The American flag wall clock ticked in the living room, but its sound was the only thing that broke the silence. The kitchen smelled like last night's food, cold pizza left in an open cardboard box on the table. The box was wrinkled, with greasy pepperoni stains, and there were a couple of crumpled napkins lying around that no one had bothered to throw away. The Keurig coffee maker stood silently, without its usual morning hum, and on the floor, at the table leg, lay a broken coffee mug white, with the words "Best Husband" in red letters. The shards glistened in the dim light, one piece with the letter B rolled towards the wall. Jason Clark stood in the upstairs bedroom, by the open closet. He was wearing a gray t-shirt, faded jeans and sneakers, still damp from the night's rain. His face was pale, with dark circles under his eyes, and the stubble on his chin grew thicker, giving him the appearance of a man who had not slept for a long time. He silently packed his bag, a black Nike sports bag, old, with a worn logo. Things were flying inside. A couple of shirts, jeans, socks, a toothbrush, everything was thrown out of order, as if he was not going, but running. His movements were sharp but precise, like those of a man who had made a decision and was not going to change it. The rain pattered on the roof, and each sound reverberated in his head, intensifying the dull pain lodged somewhere behind his eyes. The bedroom door creaked and Emily entered. She looked as if she had not slept either. Her hair was disheveled. There were shadows under her eyes that were not hidden by a thin layer of makeup, which she apparently hastily applied in the morning. She was still wearing the same gray hooded sweater, leggings, and bare feet. Her nails were painted pale pink, but the polish had already begun to crack. Her gaze was tired, but there was a spark in it, either despair or challenge. She stood in the doorway and crossed her arms over her chest, watching as he stuffed his phone charger into his bag. "Are you really leaving?" she asked, and her voice was hoarse, as if she had been screaming all night, although she had not. Just like that, without talking. Jason didn't answer. He pulled an old sweatshirt out of his dresser drawer, threw it into his bag, and zipped it up with a sharp sound. His jaw was clenched, his lips a thin line, and he didn't even look at her. Emily stepped closer, her bare feet padding across the wooden floor. "Jace, listen to me," she said, a tremor in her tone. "I didn't want it to turn out like this. I wanted you to lose and remember me." She paused, swallowed, her eyes sparkled. "You were so absorbed in this campaign that I became invisible. Trevor, he was just there when you weren't." Jason froze, his hand frozen on the zipper of his bag. He slowly turned to her, and his eyes, dark as storm clouds, met her gaze. There were no tears in them, only cold, burning rage, mixed with something that he himself could not name. "Did you want me to lose?" he asked, and his voice was low, dangerously quiet. You sat with him in a motel, half naked, with my plans in your hands, and you wanted me to come back to you. Do you even hear what it sounds like, Emily? She took a step back. Her face went pale, but she didn't look away. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. I hear, she said, and her voice became louder, sharper. I hear you blaming me for everything, as if you were a saint. Do you think it was easy for me to watch you live only in this damn city hall? You didn't even notice when I left, when I came back. Trevor made me feel like I mattered, and you turned me into a shadow. Jason dropped his bag on the bed and walked toward her so quickly that she flinched. His face was inches from hers, and he looked down at her, his breathing heavy and ragged. Did I turn you into a shadow? He growled, and his voice broke into a scream. I worked like hell to give us life so that this city wouldn't drown in shit, and you went and sold me to the first bastard with whiskey and a smile. You're not a shadow, Emily. You are a knife in my back. She opened her mouth to answer, but her voice trembled and a sob came out instead of words. She hit him in the chest, not hard, but hard, her fists hitting his t-shirt. You can't just write me out, she shouted, and tears finally flowed down her cheeks, leaving dark trails of mascara. We're married, Jace. 11 years. You can't just walk away like I don't matter. Jason grabbed her wrists and squeezed not painfully, but firmly enough to stop her. His eyes were burning, but something flashed in them, not pity, but fatigue, deep as an abyss. You crossed yourself out, he said, and his voice became quieter, but this made it even more terrible. The second you gave him my papers. When you undressed in that room, I'm not the one leaving, Em. It was you who broke everything. He let go of her hands, and they hung along her body like broken wings. She looked at him, choking with tears, but he had already turned away. He took his bag from the bed, threw it over his shoulder, and walked towards the door. Emily rushed after him and grabbed his hand. Jace, please, she gasped, her voice filled with desperation. We can talk. We can fix everything. Don't go. He stopped and looked at her over his shoulder. His face was stony, but there was a shadow in the corners of his eyes, a brief moment of doubt, which he immediately suppressed. To correct? He asked, and there was nothing left in his voice except coldness. You broke everything we had. There's no turning back. He pulled his hand away and went down the stairs, his steps echoing loudly in the empty house. Emily was left standing in the bedroom doorway, her shoulders shaking, tears dripping onto the floor. She shouted after him. You'll regret this, Jason Clark. You will regret it, but he didn't turn around. He walked through the living room, where the clock was still ticking, through the kitchen, where the cold pizza lay in a box, as a symbol of their dead coziness. The pieces of the best husband mug crunched on the floor, and he stopped, looking at them. His hand clutched her house keys, a simple set with a star keychain that she had once chosen. He threw them onto the counter sharply, with a metallic clang that echoed throughout the room. That was the end. Not just care, period. Jason opened the back door and stepped into the rain. His car sat in the driveway, wet, dark as his thoughts. He got behind the wheel and threw his bag onto the passenger seat, where that photo from the fair still lay, now wrinkled and faded. The engine started with a low growl, and he drove away without looking back. The door to the house remained open, the rain pattered on the threshold, and inside Emily fell to her knees, her sobs muffled by the ticking of the clock. On the kitchen floor, the shards of the mug glittered like broken promises, and the keys lay on the counter, cold, motionless, a symbol of the fact that there was no longer a home to return to. Jason Clark's campaign headquarters looked like it had been through a hurricane, or rather, several nights of no sleep and too much caffeine. The rented warehouse on the outskirts of Columbus was littered with junk. Empty Red Bull cans lay on and under folding tables, crumpled Jason for Mayor flyers protruded from an overflowing trash can, and the carpet was littered with chipped crumbs and spilled energy drink stains. The old coffee machine in the corner had finally broken down. Now it just hummed like a dying animal, giving out nothing but the smell of burnt wiring. A fresh start poster was still hanging on the wall, but now it was attached with only a single piece of tape and dangled in the draft coming from the half-open window. Behind the glass, a dark parking lot was visible, illuminated by one blinking lantern, and the night seemed endless. Jason sat at the table, in front of an open laptop, the same old Dell with a cracked frame. He was wearing a black sweatshirt, frayed at the elbows, and jeans that he had not changed since yesterday. His hair was disheveled, the stubble had turned into an almost full beard, and his eyes, red from fatigue, did not look away from the screen. He typed quickly, his fingers tapping the keys like a machine gun, editing a new speech for the next rally. Nearby lay a stack of papers, updated campaign plans, meeting schedules, donor lists, all rewritten from scratch after what he'd seen at the motel. The air in the room was heavy, thick with the smell of aluminum cans and his own sweat. Sitting across from him was Mike Reed, his right-hand man, with his head buried in his laptop, a newer MacBook he'd brought from home. Mike was wearing the same Buckeyes sweatshirt, but now with a ketchup stain on the sleeve, and Adidas sneakers under the table, sitting in his socks, rubbing his neck. There was another can of Red Bull in front of him, half full, and he shook it periodically to check how much was left. His face was drawn, but his eyes had the same stubborn fire that Jason had. "Okay, right here," Mike said, pointing his finger at the screen of his laptop. His voice was husky but cheerful, as if the caffeine was still keeping him afloat. "We are removing everything about subsidies for small businesses. Trevor already knows about this, and he will turn it against you. Instead, we push the topic of schools, specifically renovations in Franklinton. People love it when you name streets they know." Jason nodded, not looking up from his text. His fingers froze on the keys. He crossed out the paragraph and replaced it with a new one. "I agree," he muttered, "and let's add about taxes. No vague promises. Specifically, cut spending on the mayor's office and transfer it to infrastructure. Let Trevor try to fend this off." Mike chuckled, took a sip of Red Bull, winced at the metallic taste. "Good move," he said, leaning back. His chair creaked and almost tipped over, but he caught his balance. "What about Emily? She's still on the schedule for Saturday's rally. You don't want her there, right?" Jason froze. His gaze fell on the can of Red Bull in front of him, empty, crushed in his fist an hour ago. He clenched his jaw and slowly looked up at Mike. "She's out," he said, his voice as hard as steel. "Fully. No rallies, no leaflets, nothing. She is suspended from all activities. I don't want her anywhere near the campaign." Mike nodded, but his eyebrows raised slightly. "Okay, boss," he said, returning to his laptop. "I'll cross her off the list. But are you sure? People are used to seeing you together. This may raise questions." Jason slammed his fist on the table, not hard, but enough to make the cans jump. His eyes flashed, but he immediately pulled himself together and exhaled through his nose. "Let them ask," he said quietly, but his voice rang with inflexibility. "I'm not going to pretend for the sake of a picture. She betrayed me, Mike. She betrayed the campaign. We will win fairly without her. No lies." Mike looked at him and nodded again, more seriously now. "Honestly," he said, typing something on the keyboard, "I will send the team a new strategy. We'll rebuild everything overnight. We still have time before the debate." Jason returned to his text, but his fingers slowed. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with his hands, feeling the stubble scratching his palms. The room was quiet, only the hum of the wind outside the window and the clatter of Mike's keys. He pulled his phone out of his pocket, an old iPhone with a cracked screen that he'd been meaning to replace for a long time. The screen lit up, showing the time 2:47 am, but his gaze caught on the gallery icon. He knew what was there, he knew that he shouldn't look, but the hand itself pressed on it. The first photo that popped up was their wedding photo. 11 years ago, it was a hot June day in Ohio. He is in a black suit, with a stupid smile. She is in a white dress, with a bouquet of daisies, laughing, looking at him. They stood in front of an old church. The sun was shining so brightly that the photographer cursed at the shadows. Jason looked at the photo and his chest tightened, not from anger, but from something else, warm and painful at the same time. He remembered how she had tripped over the hem of her dress, and he had caught her, and they had both laughed while the guests clapped. The moment of weakness struck like lightning short, sharp, making him doubt. Maybe he's too tough, maybe she's right, and he really lost her. His finger hovered over the screen, his breathing hitched. But then he remembered the motel, her half-naked, Trevor with his papers, whiskey on the table. The smile from the photo became false, like a mask, and weakness gave way to cold rage. He squeezed the phone, opened his contacts, found her number M with a heart, which she herself added years ago. His thumb pressed lock, and the screen blinked in confirmation. The heart disappeared, only the number remained, now dead to him. He tossed the phone onto the table, face down, and returned to his laptop. Mike noticed this out of the corner of his eye, but remained silent. He finished his Red Bull, crushed the can, threw it in the trash, missed, and it rolled on the floor. "Are you okay?" he finally asked, not looking at Jason, pretending to be busy with the text. Jason nodded, his fingers tapping the keys again. "Yes," he said briefly, "better than ever. We're rewriting the game, Mike. No leaks, no traitors. It's just us and the truth." Mike chuckled and grinned. "This is my Jace," he said, slamming his hand on the table. "Will of steel, brother. Trevor is finished." Jason didn't smile back, but his eyes narrowed, and there was a spark in them, not weakness, but determination, hard as concrete. He opened a new can of Red Bull, took a sip, winced at the strong taste. There was a crumpled leaflet with his face on it on the table, and he smoothed it out with his hand, looking at the words, "Your voice." This was not just a promise to voters, it was a promise to myself. He will win, honestly, without her. As the night wore on, the cans of Red Bull multiplied, and the headquarters was buzzing with activity. Outside, the rain had died down, leaving only silence, but inside Jason was building a new campaign from the ashes of his old life, with a will that nothing could break. The phone lay silent, her number was erased, and he never looked back. It was a bright and noisy afternoon at the local WCMH studio, with spotlights flooding the small stage, reflecting off the glossy table and highlighting every detail. The cameras were buzzing, the cameramen were talking through headsets, and the presenter, the same Caitlin with short hair and hoop earrings, sat across from Emily Clark, holding a tablet with questions in her hands. The studio was modest. A couple of upholstered chairs, a fake plant in the corner, and a fake view of Columbus behind them, taken on a sunny day, although gray clouds still hung in the window from an overnight rain. There were no spectators in the hall, only the channel team, but the broadcast was live, and the red light on the camera was blinking, reminding that thousands of eyes were now watching. Emily sat upright, but her shoulders were slightly hunched, as if she was carrying an invisible weight. She was wearing a simple blue blouse, slightly wrinkled, and jeans nothing like the polished candidate's wife she had been at the barbecue. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a low ponytail, but a few strands had escaped, falling into her face, and there were shadows under her eyes that makeup couldn't hide. Her hands trembled, clutching a handkerchief white, crumpled, stained with tears. She looked broken, but there was a theatricality about it, like an actress who knows where the camera is. Caitlin leaned forward, her voice soft, but with a hint of curiosity, like a reporter smelling a scoop. "Mrs. Clark, Emily," she began, looking into her eyes, "the last few days have been turbulent, to put it mildly. Your husband, Jason Clark, a mayoral candidate, left home after rumors of your, well, let's say, falling out. What can you tell our viewers? What's going on in your family?" Emily swallowed, her lips trembling. She raised the handkerchief to her eyes, dabbed them, and tears immediately appeared again, shiny, visible in the spotlight. Her voice was quiet, trembling, but she chose her words carefully. "He chose his career over me," she said, her voice breaking on the last word. She paused, as if gathering her strength, then continued. "I was by his side all these years, supported him, sacrificed everything. And he just wrote me off like I didn't matter. All for the sake of this campaign, for the sake of power. I'm left alone, Caitlin, all alone." Tears streamed down her cheeks, leaving dark trails of mascara, and she pressed the handkerchief to her face, sobbing. Caitlin reached out and touched her shoulder, a gesture of sympathy, rehearsed but seemingly sincere. "This must be incredibly difficult," the presenter said, shaking her head. "Do you feel betrayed?" Emily nodded, her sobs getting louder, but she quickly pulled herself together and looked at the camera. Her blue eyes sparkled, and a spark flashed in them, not only pain, but also something sharp, almost calculating. "Yes," she breathed, "devoted. I gave him 11 years, and he abandoned me for votes. He didn't even try to talk, he just left. I don't know how to live on." Caitlin nodded, her face becoming more serious. "Thanks for sharing this, Emily. We all feel for you," she said, turning to the camera. It was Emily Clark, wife of mayoral candidate Jason Clark, with her story. Stay tuned after the ad to discuss how this will impact the election. The spotlights flickered, the cameras turned off, and Caitlin removed her hand from Emily's shoulder, immediately switching to a conversation with the cameraman. Emily remained sitting, wiping away tears, but her lips trembled slightly in the shadow of a smile that no one noticed. The scandal had been set in motion, and she knew it would escalate. At Jason's campaign headquarters, the air was filled with the smell of old carpet and energy drinks. Although the cans of Red Bull had already run out, there were now a couple of empty bottles of Mountain Dew on the table. An old Sony TV sat in the corner on a rickety stand and hummed, showing a live feed of WCMH. The screen was cloudy, with a thin scratch across the middle, but the sound was clear and Emily's words echoed throughout the room. Jason stood in front of him, arms crossed over his chest, wearing the same black hoodie and jeans. His face was stony, but his fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Mike Reed sat at the table behind him, his head glued to his laptop, but his eyes kept flicking up to the screen. "He chose his career, not me," Emily's voice repeated from the TV, and Jason felt everything inside him shrink, like a spring ready to burst. Her tears, her trembling voice, her accusations, all this was like a blow below the belt, public, in front of the whole city. Mike leaned back in his chair, threw his pen on the table, and it rolled to the edge, falling to the floor with a thud. "She's playing the victim," he said, and his voice was dry, with a slight hint of irritation. "Damn, Jace, she knows how to squeeze out tears for the camera. This is pure theater." Jason didn't answer. His gaze was glued to the screen, where Emily was wiping her eyes with a handkerchief and Caitlin was nodding sympathetically. His face hardened with every word, his cheekbones tensed, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes darkened like a stormy sky. He felt the anger growing, hot and heavy, like molten metal in his chest. She portrayed him as a monster, a careerist who abandoned his poor wife for the sake of ambition. And this after everything, after the motel, after Trevor, after her betrayal. "I'm left alone," Emily sobbed on the screen, and Jason clenched his fists even tighter, feeling his nails digging into his palms. The blood pounded in his temples, drowning out her voice, but he heard every word, and each one was like salt in a wound. Mike stood up, walked over to him, and put his hand on his shoulder. "Turn that shit off, Jace," he said quietly. "Don't waste your nerves. She wants you to lose it so that it becomes an even bigger scandal. Don't let her win." Jason shook his head, not taking his eyes off the TV. The broadcast switched to commercials, a cheerful voice praising a new Ford pickup truck, but he still saw her face, her tears, her lies. His fists shook, and he clenched them so hard that he felt the old key scar on his palm open again, but the pain only fueled his anger. "She thinks she can go ahead and rewrite everything," he finally said, and his voice was low, hoarse, like a growl. "Make me look like a bastard, and make yourself look like a saint. After what she did." Mike removed his hand, stepped towards the TV, and turned it off with one sharp press. The screen went dark, leaving only silence and the faint hum of the air conditioner outside the window. "Let him say what he wants," Mike said, turning to him. "People are not fools. They will see who is real here. But you need to control yourself, brother. If you fail, she will get what she wants, you in the mud and Trevor on a horse." Jason exhaled through his nose, his chest heaving. He turned around, walked to the table, grabbed a bottle of Mountain Dew, squeezed it, but didn't open it. His face was like stone, motionless, cold, but inside everything was seething. He put the bottle back, so hard the plastic cracked, and rested his hands on the table, looking at the laptop. "She won't get anything," he said, and his voice became harder than steel. "Neither me nor the campaign. Let him cry as much as he wants. I'll end this on my terms." Mike nodded, returned to his chair, and sat down. "That's my Jace," he said, grinning, but there was a flicker of worry in his eyes. "We will survive this circus. The main thing is to keep your head cool." Jason didn't answer. He looked at the darkened television, where his own face was reflected dark, tense, with anger that he could barely contain. The scandal was growing like a fire, but it was not going to burn in it. His fists unclenched, leaving red marks on his palms, and he sat down at his laptop, opening the plan for his next step. Emily could play the victim, but he wouldn't let her break him. Not now. The press conference room at Columbus City Hall was small, but buzzing like a beehive before the rain. A long table, covered with a shabby blue tablecloth, stood against the wall. Behind it were 3 chairs, but only one was occupied. There were a dozen microphones piled on the table, with the logos of local channels, newspapers, and even one national channel, CNN, which decided to look into this scandal. Behind the table stood a tribune with the city's coat of arms, a golden star on a blue background, slightly faded with time. The walls of the room were paneled with wood, darkened in places by damp, and the air smelled like a mixture of old carpet and the cologne of the reporters crammed into the cramped space. The windows were closed, the blinds were drawn, and the light from the chandeliers reflected off the cameras, microphones, and sweaty faces of journalists. Jason Clark stood behind the podium, straightened like a soldier before battle. He was wearing a dark blue suit, not new, but ironed, with a red tie, which he tied in the morning with hands trembling from fatigue. His face was shaved for the first time in a week, but there were still shadows under his eyes and harsh lines at the corners of his mouth. On the table in front of him lay a lonely notebook, black, with blank pages, without Emily's usual pen, which was always nearby, with her neat handwriting and notes. Now there was nothing there but his own hands, gripping the edges of the podium, and microphones pointed at him like gun barrels. The hall was noisy. Reporters, about 30 of them, with notebooks, phones, and cameras, were talking, rustling papers, coughing. Caitlin from WCMH sat in the front row, her hoop earrings sparkling as she whispered to the cameraman. Nearby is a correspondent for the local Columbus Dispatch newspaper, a balding man in a wrinkled shirt, already scribbling something in a notebook. Jason took a deep breath, feeling the air get stuck in his throat, and tapped his finger on the podium, calling for silence. The noise died down, the cameras buzzed louder, and he began. "Thank you for coming," he said, and his voice was deep, firm, with that hoarseness that caught people at rallies. "I know the last few days have been full of rumors about my family, about my campaign, about me. I'm here to clear things up once and for all." He paused and looked around the room. Reporters watched him like hawks watching their prey, waiting for the slightest weakness. He straightened up even stronger and squeezed the podium. "My personal life does not negate my honesty," he said, emphasizing every word. "I'm getting a divorce. This is true. But that doesn't change what I stand for. I'm a mayoral candidate not because I want power, but because this city deserves someone who will work for the people, not himself. And I'm that person." The hall began to buzz again, whispers, clicks of cameras, creaking of chairs. Caitlin raised her hand without waiting in line, her voice cutting through the noise. "Mr. Clark, your wife gave an interview yesterday," she said, and there was a hint of provocation in her tone. "She said you left her for your career. How would you comment on this? People want to know what's going on behind the scenes." Jason clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowed, but he responded immediately, sharply, not giving her time for a second shot. "Emily can say anything," he said, his voice growing colder. "But the truth is that she betrayed me. Not the other way around. I'm not going to go into details. This is my business, not yours. But if you want to know why I'm here, here's the answer. I don't run away from problems. I solve them. And I will solve the problems of this city, with or without my wife. The dispatch reporter jumped up, nearly knocking over his chair, and jabbed his pen at him. What about the rumors about Trevor Logan? He shouted, interrupting the roar. They say your wife was intimate with him. This is true? And how does this relate to your campaign? The hall froze, the cameras turned closer, the microphones stretched out like hungry animals. Jason felt the blood rush to his face, but he didn't flinch. His fingers tightened on the podium, his knuckles turned white, and he leaned forward, looking straight at the reporter. Trevor Logan plays dirty, he said, and his voice became louder, sharper, like a hammer blow. He uses everything he can to undermine me, my family, my reputation, my plans. Yes, he had my documents. Yes, he got them through my wife. But you know what? It won't break me. This proves who he is, a man who can't win fair because he has nothing of his own. I'm taking control right now. We move on without his games. The noise in the hall exploded. Questions rained down from all sides. Voices shouted over each other. The woman from CNN stood up, her red logo microphone standing out from the rest. You accuse Logan of foul play, but where is the evidence? She asked, her tone calm but sharp as a blade. This is a serious accusation. Can you back it up? Jason looked at her, his gaze like steel. He straightened up, throwing all caution to the wind. Proof? He asked, and there was a hint of mockery in his voice. My budget plans ended up on his desk. My drafts, which no one else had except my team. This is not a coincidence, this is a fact. I saw it with my own eyes. Want more details? Ask him how he spends his evenings at the motel. But I'm not here to dig in the mud. I'm here to say, I'm purer than he is, and I'll prove it by my deeds. The reporters began to shout louder, the cameras clicked like machine guns. Caitlin stood up again, her earrings jingling. You talk about honesty, but how can voters trust you after such a scandal? She shouted. Your personal life is in ruins. Will this distract you from your work? Jason leaned into the microphones, his voice becoming louder, sharper, like a clap of thunder. My personal life is my burden, and I carry it myself, he barked. But I won't let her stop me. I'm not Trevor, who hides behind other people's backs and other people's mistakes. I stand here in front of you openly. Ask what you want, but I will answer one thing. I will be a mayor who works for you, not for his ego. And period. The room exploded with questions, but Jason raised his hand to cut them off. His face was hard as granite, his eyes burned with determination. He took control not only of the press conference, but also of the story that was being written without him. The reporters pressed, their voices merged into a hum, but he answered briefly, sharply, cutting off unnecessary things. Mr. Clark, what do you say about? I've said enough. Look at my actions, not the rumors. What if Logan sues for libel? Let him try. I have the truth. How will you cope with? The way I've always coped, with work, not with words. He finished, stepped back from the podium, but did not sit down. His gaze looked around the hall, lingering on the cameras, on the faces of the reporters, greedy for another sensation. He didn't give it to them, he gave them a challenge. A lonely notebook remained on the table, without her pen, without her traces. This was his desk now, his campaign, his story. He nodded to Mike, who was standing against the wall with his hands in his pockets, and he grinned, letting him know that the blow was on target. The reporters were still shouting questions, but Jason turned and walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The door to City Hall slammed behind him, leaving the din behind. He walked outside, where the rain had finally died down, and the air was fresh, cold, like his new resolve. The scandal could burn as long as it wanted, but he would not let it consume him. He took the narrative into his own hands and won't let go. The studio of local television station WCMH was filled with tension, as if before a thunderstorm. It was the last debate before the election, and the air in the room was buzzing with anticipation. The stage was simple. Two podiums made of dark wood, between them was the presenter's table, behind which sat Rick Harper, the same balding guy with the voice of a smoker. The spotlights hit the eyes, reflected from glossy surfaces, and emphasized every drop of sweat on the faces of the participants. The audience, about 100 people, from workers in jeans to local businessmen in jackets, sat on folding chairs, rustling programs and whispering among themselves. The cameras buzzed, the red lights flashed, and the broadcast went live, covering all of Columbus. Jason Clark stood behind the left podium, straight as a steel rod. He was wearing the same dark blue suit from the press conference, but now the tie was slightly loosened and the shirt was slightly wrinkled, a sign of long hours of preparation. His face was shaved, but his eyes burned dark, furious, with barely contained energy. There was a notebook in front of him, the same lonely black one, without a single note, and he clutched the edges of the podium, his knuckles white from tension. Opposite, behind the right podium, stood Trevor Logan. His gray suit was immaculate, his hair gelled, and his smile straight out of a toothpaste commercial. But there was a shadow in his eyes, uncertainty, which he tried to hide behind feigned confidence. Rick Harper cleared his throat and tapped his pen on the table, looking at the camera. "Good evening, Columbus," he began, his voice booming through the microphone. "Today we have the final debate of mayoral candidates, Jason Clark and Trevor Logan. The topic is the future of the city. Let's start with the budget. Mr. Clark, you have the floor." Jason nodded and leaned toward the microphone. His voice was deep, firm, with that hoarseness that made people listen. "Thank you, Rick," he said, looking around the room. "This city is drowning in inefficiency. We spend millions on projects that don't work, parking lots that sit empty, offices that no one uses. I propose cutting this fat, transferring money to where it is needed: schools, roads, jobs. Franklinton doesn't have to wait another 10 years for kids to be in dry classrooms. These are not promises, this is a plan, and I have it." The audience applauded, not loudly, but approvingly. Several people in the front row, wearing Ohio State caps, nodded, whispering to their neighbors. Rick turned to Trevor. "Mr. Logan, what is your answer?" Trevor smiled, straightened his tie, and leaned towards the microphone. "Jason likes to talk about fat, but he forgets the details," he said, his voice smooth, slightly mocking. "His cuts will hit people builders, small contractors. What about his plans for schools? He wants to freeze renovations in the eastern areas so he can throw everything at Franklinton. It's not fair, Rick. This is a selective policy." Jason's grip on the podium tightened, his eyes narrowing. Trevor again pulled out the eastern regions, the same trump card as on the talk show. Fury flared up in his chest, hot and heavy, but he held it back and exhaled through his nose. The audience began to make noise, and someone shouted, "Is this true?" Rick raised his hand for silence and nodded at Jason. "Mr. Clark, what do you think?" Jason leaned forward, his gaze boring into Trevor, but he spoke calmly, marking every word. "I wonder, Trevor, how you know about the eastern regions," he said, and his voice became lower, more dangerous. "This was not in my public speeches. It was in drafts that no one but my team saw. But you know them. How did this happen?" The hall froze. The spectators looked at each other. Whispers ran through the rows like wind through dry grass. Trevor blinked, his smile wavered, but he quickly pulled himself together and laughed short, strained. "Are you accusing me of something, Jason?" he asked, shrugging his shoulders. "This is just an analysis. Your ideas aren't that secret. Anyone could." "No," Jason interrupted him, and his voice became louder, sharper, like a hammer blow. "Not just anyone. These drafts were stolen, leakage, and you used them. You knew my every move: subsidies, schools, taxes. You guessed right, Trevor. They gave them to you." Trevor turned pale, his hand gripping the edge of the podium. The audience gasped, and someone in the back row shouted, "Why at?" The cameras turned closer. The cameramen caught every gesture. Rick coughed, trying to regain control. "This is a serious charge, Mr. Clark," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Can you prove it?" Jason straightened up, his eyes burning, but he didn't raise his voice. He made it colder, sharper, like a blade. "I saw your cards, Trevor," he said, looking into his eyes. "The papers with my numbers, my plans, are on your table. I will not name names, this is my burden, and I carry it. But you didn't get them honestly, and you thought that I would break. And I'm standing here, and I'm stronger than you think. The hall exploded a roar of voices, camera clicks, applause mixed with screams. A woman in the front row jumped up, clapping, and a man nearby shouted, "Prove it to him, Clark." Trevor pursed his lips, his face turned red, and he slammed his fist onto the podium, losing his composure. "This is a lie," he barked, his voice breaking. "You're making things up to cover up your failure. You have no proof, Clark. These are just words." Jason leaned toward the microphone, his gaze like a blow. Rage boiled inside, but he kept it on a short leash, allowing it only to fuel his words. "No evidence?" he asked, and there was a hint of mockery in his voice. "What about the fact that you knew my every move before I even took it? You're not a genius, Trevor. You're a crook, and people see it." The crowd booed louder, and someone shouted, "Tell him, Jason." Trevor opened his mouth to answer, but his voice was lost in the noise. He clenched his fists, his face contorted with anger, and he pointed a finger in Jason's direction. "You're pathetic, Clark," he shouted, but his words sounded weak, like the barking of a cornered dog. "All you have are accusations. You have nothing." Jason smiled coldly, barely noticeable, but this smile was sharper than a knife. He leaned even closer to the microphone. His voice became quieter, but this made it even more powerful. "I have the truth," he said, "and that's enough to bury you." The hall exploded with applause, loud and deafening. People jumped up from their seats, clapped, shouted his name. Trevor stepped back from the podium, his face red, sweat running down his temple and his smile fading, replaced by confusion. He tried to say something, but Rick raised his hand, cutting off the debate. "Time's up, gentlemen," he said, looking into the camera. "Thanks to the candidates. The decision is yours, Columbus." The spotlights flickered and the cameras switched to the audience, but Jason didn't move. His chest heaved heavily, rage still seething inside, but he held it in, clenching it in his fist like a hot coal. He looked at Trevor, who looked away, wiping sweat from his brow, and felt something let go, not pain, but the weight of betrayal. He didn't name Emily, didn't give her that power, but he hit where it hurt Trevor, and the blow hit home. The audience was still clapping as he walked away from the podium, his steps firm and confident. Mike met him at the edge of the stage and patted him on the shoulder, grinning. "You destroyed it, brother," he said quietly. This was the final blow. Jason nodded, but didn't smile. His face was stern, his eyes alight with triumph, but the rage still smoldered beneath the surface. He won this round, not just a debate, but a battle with betrayal, with lies, with the past. He turned to the audience, raised his hand in a short gesture of gratitude, and the applause grew louder. Trevor was left standing at the podium, lost, broken, while Jason walked forward, leaving him behind. Election night in Columbus was cold and clear, the sky cleared of clouds, and the stars twinkled over the city like distant lanterns. The polling place on the outskirts of Franklinton, an old schoolhouse with peeling paint and creaking doors, was buzzing with activity early in the morning. People in coats and caps stood in lines, holding paper cups of coffee in their hands, talking about the weather and the candidates' chances. Jason Clark arrived there in his Ford Explorer at noon, wearing a navy suit with a loose tie, shaking hands with several voters, nodding to volunteers wearing T-shirts with his logo. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed tension, dark, tired, with a spark that he kept under control. He voted quickly, checked the ballot, threw it in the box, and left without stopping for a photo. It was his day, but he didn't want to tempt fate. By evening, the action moved to the campaign headquarters, the same rented warehouse, now decorated for the holiday. Tables were pushed against the walls, stacked with trays of pizza, bags of chips, and cases of Bud Light beer chilled in plastic ice buckets. The Jason for Mayor a Fresh Start poster hung straight, secured with fresh tape, and on the opposite wall flickered a string of cheap, last-minute light bulbs. An old Sony TV, still with a scratch on the screen, stood in the center, connected to a cable, showing a live broadcast of the results. The team, about 20 people, from Mike Reed to student volunteers, huddled around, holding beers and phones, checking news sites for updates. The air smelled of sweat, fumes, and nervous anticipation. Jason stood a little to the side, by the window, looking out at the dark parking lot. His suit was still the same, but he had taken off his jacket, leaving him in a shirt with the sleeves rolled up. The red tie was lying somewhere on the table, forgotten in the bustle. He held a bottle of Bud Light in his hand, but did not drink. He simply swirled it in his fingers, feeling the coldness of the glass. On the table nearby lay another bottle empty, with the label peeled off, which Emily usually opened with her old star opener. Now she stood alone, a reminder of what was no longer there. The television buzzed louder, the WCMH anchor's voice cutting through the noise of the room. "And here's the latest data," he said, his face glowing on the screen. "With 95% of the votes counted, we have a winner. Jason Clark scores 53% to Trevor Logan's 46%. Columbus, you have a new mayor." The headquarters exploded. Screams, whistles, claps. The team rushed to hug. Someone spilled beer on the carpet. Mike Reed shouted, "I told you so, damn it," and slapped the nearest volunteer on the back so that he almost fell. The pizza flew into the air, the lights were flashing like crazy, and someone turned on country music, loud and cheerful, drowning out the TV. People were screaming his name, "Jason, Jason," and stretched out their hands to shake his hand or slap him on the shoulder. But Jason didn't move. He stood at the window, looking at his reflection in the glass pail, with a hard jaw and eyes that mixed triumph and something else, heavy as lead. His chest heaved slowly. He squeezed the beer bottle tighter, feeling the glass cool in his palm. Victory. He did it. After everything, betrayal, scandals, nights without sleep, he won. But the joy was bitter, like old wine, mixed with the taste of loneliness. Mike made his way through the crowd, his face flushed with beer and excitement. He grabbed Jason by the shoulder and shook him. "Did you hear, brother?" He shouted over the noise. "You are the mayor. We destroyed this bastard. Are you okay?" Jason nodded, turned to him, forced a smile short but sincere. "Yes, Mike," he said, his voice hoarse but firm. "We did it. Thank you." Mike slapped him again, harder, and walked back into the crowd, shouting something about a toast. The team cheered, someone opened another case of beer, and the music got louder. But Jason remained at the window, looking out at the parking lot where his car was parked under the flashing lights. His fingers squeezed the bottle, and he took a sip, the first of the evening, cold, sharp, but not removing the heaviness from his chest. The phone in his pocket vibrated, interrupting his thoughts. He pulled it out, an old iPhone with a cracked screen, and looked at the number. Unfamiliar, but with Columbus code. He pressed the green button and brought the phone to his ear. "Jason Clark," he said, moving away from the window so he could hear over the din. The voice on the other end was dry, professional, with a slight Midwestern accent. "Mr. Clark, this is David Hill, your lawyer," the man said. "Congratulations on your victory. I just received confirmation that the divorce papers are ready. Emily signed them this morning. Everything is completed if you give the go-ahead." Jason froze, his gaze falling on the empty bottle of beer on the table. Emily, her hands opening those bottles at their parties, her laughter when she spilled beer on her shirt. Now it was in the past, officially, finally. He clutched the phone, feeling the old key scar on his palm, aching under the pressure. "Thank you, David," he said quietly. His voice was even, but there was a shadow in it. "Let's finish this. Send me a copy tomorrow." "It will be done," answered the lawyer. "Congratulations again, Mayor Clark." The line went dead, and Jason put the phone in his pocket. He stood silently, looking at the bottle, at its peeled-off label, at the emptiness it left on the table. The victory was his, the mayor of Columbus, a man who survived betrayal and dirt to rise to the top. But it was bittersweet, like that sip of beer, mixed with a loss he couldn't deny. He won the city, but lost the house. The team was still cheering. Someone played "Sweet Home Alabama," and Mike danced with a volunteer, spilling beer on the floor. Jason looked at them, feeling the corner of his mouth twitch into a faint smile. They deserve it. He deserved it. But he didn't join them. He walked up to the table, took the empty bottle, turned it over in his hands, then put it back quietly, almost tenderly, like a farewell. He returned to the window, leaning against the sill, looking at the stars above the parking lot. His chest heaved slowly, the tension released, but not completely. Victory was his triumph, proof that he was stronger than betrayal, stronger than Trevor, stronger than pain. But alone at the window, he felt its price cold, like glass in his hand, bitter, like beer that there was no one to open. The TV was still humming, showing his face on the screen, the winner, the mayor, the man who hadn't broken. But he didn't look at him. He looked into the night, and his eyes were hard, but wet not from tears, but from something he would not name out loud. The morning of the inauguration in Columbus was frosty and clear. The January sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows on the steps of City Hall. The building, old with darkened brick walls and chipped ornamentation above the entrance, was decorated with Ohio and US flags fluttering in the wind. A crowd had gathered in front of him, hundreds of people, from workers in heavy jackets to families with children wrapped in scarves. They held coffee glasses in their hands, exhaled steam into the cold air, and chatted, waiting for the start. The podium stood at the top of the stairs, simple, wooden, with the city's coat of arms and a bunch of microphones pointed at it like a flock of hungry birds. Cameras from local channels, and even a couple of national ones, CNN and Fox, were buzzing, filming everything live. Jason Clark walked out of City Hall at 10 o'clock sharp, his footsteps echoing on the stone. He was wearing a new suit, black, strict, with a white shirt and a red tie, tied neatly, without trembling in his hands. His face was clean-shaven, his hair was combed, but there were still faint shadows under his eyes, traces of months of struggle that had not been erased even now. He looked older than at the beginning of the campaign, but stronger. There was a steely confidence in his posture, a calm forged in fire in his eyes. The crowd applauded, not loudly, but warmly, and he nodded to them, briefly, without a smile, but with gratitude. Mike Reed stood nearby, wearing a navy blue coat over a Buckeyes sweatshirt, and tapped him on the shoulder before moving to the edge of the podium. The judge, an elderly woman with gray hair tied in a bun and wearing a black robe, raised her right hand, holding in the other a worn Bible with gold letters on the cover. Jason put his left hand on the book and raised his right, looking straight ahead, into the crowd, into the cameras, into the future. "Repeat after me," the judge said, her voice clear despite the wind. "I, Jason Clark." "I am Jason Clark," he repeated, and his voice was deep, firm, with that hoarseness that caught people. "I swear to honestly and conscientiously fulfill the duties of mayor of the city of Columbus. I swear to honestly and conscientiously fulfill the duties of mayor of the city of Columbus. Protect the interests of its inhabitants, uphold the law, and lead the city without deception. Protect the interests of its inhabitants, uphold the law, and lead the city without deception." The last words hung in the air, heavier than the rest. No deception. He said them a little louder, with a barely noticeable pause, as if emphasizing them to himself. The crowd roared, and someone shouted, "Come on, Clark." The judge nodded, put away the Bible, shook his hand. Her palm was cold, dry, but strong. "Congratulations, Mayor Clark," she said quietly, a smile twitching at the corner of her mouth. Jason nodded and turned to the microphones. His gaze scanned the crowd, workers with calloused hands, mothers with strollers, old people with canes, and he straightened up even more. "Thank you, Columbus," he began, his voice booming through the speakers, drowning out the wind. "You entrusted this city to me, and I will not let you down. We went through dirt, through lies, through betrayal, but we are here. I'm here. And I promise you, no cheating, no games, only work. We will build the future you deserve, fair, strong, ours." The crowd erupted in applause, loud and deafening. People shouted his name, waved their arms, and even the wind seemed to die down so as not to drown them out. The cameras clicked. The spotlight hit him in the face, but he didn't squint. He stood looking forward, and his eyes were clear, firm, looking towards tomorrow. Meanwhile, a few miles from City Hall, in their former home in the suburbs, the silence was oppressive. The living room was almost empty. The couch was still there, but without pillows. The coffee table was covered in a thin layer of dust, and the American flag clock ticked in the corner like a metronome in an abandoned theater. There were cardboard boxes on the floor, half filled. Emily's clothes, her books, a pair of old shoes. The kitchen was cold, the sink empty except for a lone cup of dried coffee. The television, an old flat screen they had bought together 5 years ago, sat on the cabinet, showing a live broadcast of the inauguration. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor in front of him. She was wearing a gray sweatshirt, too big, with a ketchup stain on the sleeve, and jeans that she hadn't changed in a couple of days. Her hair was disheveled, gathered into a careless bun, and there were dark circles under her eyes, a trace of sleepless nights and tears that had long since dried. She held a mug of iced tea in her hands, but did not drink, she simply squeezed it, feeling how the ceramic cooled her fingers. Her gaze was glued to the screen where Jason was saying his oath. "To lead the city without deception," he said, and his voice echoed in the empty room. Emily pursed her lips, her eyes sparkled, but she did not cry. She looked at him, at his suit, at his posture, at his face, now alien, and felt something inside shrinking, like an old wound that would not heal. The TV cut to a close-up of his hand on the Bible, his eyes looking out into the crowd. She remembered how those arms hugged her, how those eyes laughed, looking at her at that fair, at their wedding. Now they were looking past her, into a future she was not a part of. She put the mug on the floor, her hand trembled, and the tea splashed onto the carpet, leaving a dark stain. Her gaze fell on the trash can against the wall plastic, gray, with an open lid. Inside was a broken frame with their wedding photo. The glass cracked in half, their smiles his in a suit, hers with daisies were crushed, distorted, like memories that she could not hold. She threw it away yesterday in a fit of anger, but now, looking at it, she felt only emptiness. The frame lay among the trash, empty pizza boxes, crumpled napkins, her old life. The TV buzzed louder, the crowd cheered, and Jason's voice filled the room again. "We will build the future you deserve," he said, and she closed her eyes, lowering her head. He was the mayor. He won, and she stayed here, in a house that was no longer theirs, with boxes that no one would help her carry. She stood up and turned off the TV with one sharp press. The screen went dark, the reflection of her face disappeared, and the silence became absolute, only the clock ticking in the corner. She walked over to the boxes, took one, the light one, with her sweaters, and placed it by the door. Her movements were slow, mechanical, like those of someone who has given up but has not yet realized it. She will leave tomorrow, or the day after tomorrow, but it doesn't matter. He left her behind, and she knew he wouldn't look back. Back at City Hall, the ceremony is over. The crowd began to disperse, people slapping each other on the back, cameras rolled up, and the wind picked up scraps of programs, carrying them down the steps. Jason stood alone on the podium. Mike went to talk to the team, and he looked at the city, at the rooftops of Franklinton, at the smoke from the chimneys, at the lights coming on in the twilight. His chest heaved slowly as he inhaled the cold air, feeling it clear his lungs. The victory was complete. Mayor Columbus, a man who went through lies and betrayal to get here. Emily was there somewhere in the past, with her boxes and broken frames, but he didn't think about her. Not now. He thought about the schools that needed to be fixed, the roads that needed to be paved, the people who believed in him. His eyes were clear, looking forward to the future he promised to build. He straightened his tie, nodded to himself, barely noticeably, and stepped down from the podium. His steps were firm, confident, like a man who knows where he is going. The past lay in the trash can, broken and forgotten, and ahead was the city, his city. Without lies, without betrayal, only the truth, which he carried in his hands. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.